One day, my husband Charles unexpectedly revealed that he knew about the $6 million inheritance I received after my father passed away. I had kept this secret from him because I was contemplating a divorce due to his controlling nature, and I feared his greedy tendencies. His knowledge shocked me. I had barely uttered a word when he grinned and suggested using the money to remodel our family home. Upon confronting him, he admitted to coercing my mother into revealing the secret. His boldness left me seething with anger, and despite my protests, he dismissively remarked that my objections meant nothing and the decision was already made. I am Patricia, a 31-year-old who works at a prominent bank. My hectic job schedule left little room for a personal life, prompting me to join a matchmaking agency. That's where I met Charles, a jovial livery driver a year my senior. My profession rarely allowed me to meet women, and Charles felt fortunate to connect with someone like me. We shared immediate chemistry, and soon he proposed with the intention of marriage in mind. Our romance blossomed, and we married 4 years ago. Initially, our marriage was filled with love and mutual admiration. Charles often complimented my work ethic and success, which was more substantial than his own. However, as time passed, his demeanor shifted towards sarcasm and envy concerning my income. Similarly, my initially supportive in-laws began to change, their warmth turning into a chilly distance. They once praised how well I meshed with their son and expressed excitement about our future together. Yet, familial tensions, especially with in-laws, began to surface, altering the dynamic I once valued and leaving me to reconsider my relationship and the true intentions of those around me. As time passed, the true intentions of my in-laws became painfully clear. "Patricia, since you earn a good salary, why don't you buy us some things once in a while? I want a designer bag," my mother-in-law pressed, almost as if it were an obligation. Despite having recently gifted her a dress for her birthday, I stood firm on my policy of not lending or borrowing money, even to family. This stance infuriated them. "How dare you? We only accepted this marriage because you have a prestigious job at the bank. Frankly, we can't stand you. You're too outspoken," my mother-in-law erupted in anger. "What use is a daughter-in-law who doesn't financially support us? We expect birthday gifts, we're asking for cash, and yet you still refuse," my father-in-law chimed in, scolding me further while Charles merely nodded, offering no support. Adding insult to injury, Charles frequently made extravagant purchases like costly takeout and expensive furniture without discussing it with me. "You have a good income, this should be okay," he'd justify, ignoring the fact that his earnings were insufficient to cover these expenses, leaving me to manage the finances alone. Faced with constant mistreatment and a lack of support from Charles and his family, divorce seemed like the only viable option. Thankfully, we didn't have children, which simplified the decision somewhat. When I attempted to broach the topic of divorce, Charles evaded the conversation. "Divorce? I'm too tired to talk about that today. I'm heading to bed," he'd dismiss, avoiding a serious discussion at all costs. During this tumultuous time, I received a distressing call from my mother. "Hi, Mom, what's going on?" I asked, concerned. "Listen carefully, it's about your dad," she replied, her voice tense. She explained that a recent checkup had shown my father was seriously ill and needed immediate hospitalization. Understanding the urgency, I quickly prepared to leave for the hospital. As I was about to head out, Charles inquired where I was going. I explained the situation to my dad, highlighting yet another moment where I had to manage serious issues largely on my own. Charles's casual response to my urgent situation was disheartening, especially given that it concerned his father-in-law. I brushed off his indifference and hurried to the hospital to be with my mother. At the hospital, we learned from the doctor that my father had cancer with limited time left. The news was a heavy blow. My mother and I deliberated whether to tell him the full extent of his illness, but knowing he would prefer the truth, we chose honesty. Returning home heartbroken, I was met with Charles's insensitive inquiry, "Back from your dad's hospital, huh? How bad is it?" Despite my deep upset, I told him about my father's dire prognosis. His response was cruel and self-serving. "Oh, weren't you talking about divorce? If you want to stress your already ailing father with our problems, I'm ready whenever you are." His callousness sank my feelings for him even further, yet I hesitated to bring more stress upon my father. Charles's attitude grew worse, seeming almost satisfied by my increased workload and reluctance to discuss divorce. He then, shockingly, asked about my father's inheritance. "So what about your dad's inheritance? How much are we talking about? I'm his son-in-law, so I should get a share, right?" His audacity to mention such things while my father was still fighting for his life was appalling. "That's ridiculous. My dad is still alive. How can you even think about that?" I protested. But my objections didn't faze him. He continued to speculate about the potential inheritance, which disgusted me further. Unable to tolerate the situation at home, I decided to stay at my parents' house. It was closer to the hospital, and I needed to be there for my father. I informed my mother of my decision, explaining that I would be staying with them for the foreseeable future to be near my father. After some time, my father passed away peacefully, as if slipping into a gentle sleep. His departure was a profound loss, and in the quiet of those moments with my mother, I realized the depth of the challenges ahead. The grief was overwhelming. It felt as though we had exhausted all our tears, yet there were still funeral arrangements that needed our attention. Amid this sorrow, I contacted Charles to inform him of my father's passing and the upcoming funeral. Despite our strained relationship and my desire for a divorce, I felt it was necessary to inform him, given that we were still legally married. His response was as disheartening as ever. "So, your dad finally passed away, huh? Sorry for your loss, but I don't feel like attending the funeral. It's too much of a hassle," he said nonchalantly. His lack of empathy confirmed my worst suspicions about his character. I had secretly hoped he would show some respect by attending the funeral, but his indifference erased any lingering affection I might have had and turned it into disdain. I replied sharply, surprised by my frosty tone, "Do whatever you want." "Why are you so upset?" "Oh, and I'm curious about the inheritance," Charles taunted, his voice laced with mockery. Unable to endure his cruel laughter any longer, I ended the call abruptly. Ultimately, Charles did not attend my father's funeral. Some labeled him heartless, but I felt it was better he didn't appear, sparing us the pain of his presence on such a solemn occasion. It was a relief that he stayed away, allowing us to honor my father's memory undisturbed. After the funeral, my family, including my mother and me, gathered to discuss the inheritance. Thankfully, my father had made clear decisions about his estate beforehand, which allowed us to settle matters smoothly and find some closure. When I returned home, however, Charles blindsided me with an audacious plan. "Hey, it's been a while. I've decided to use the $6 million you inherited to renovate the family house," he declared. I was stunned, unable to comprehend how he knew about the money or why he assumed he could use it for renovations. "What do you mean? I have no idea about any large sum of money," I questioned, my confusion evident. With a smug chuckle, Charles revealed, "I had a chat with your mom. I might have nudged her a bit, hinting that if she didn't spill the beans about the inheritance, I might consider a divorce. She quickly spilled everything." The realization that he had coerced my mother into revealing details about the inheritance was infuriating. "You're despicable, threatening my mother just to find out. That's a low blow," I exclaimed, my voice rising with anger. "I don't care, the renovations are already underway with that $6 million, he said casually. "Yep, lucky me for snagging that cash. Good thing we're still hitched," Charles retorted smugly. While I was preoccupied with the funeral and its arrangements, he had already initiated the renovations using the inheritance. Speechless and betrayed, I was forced to confront the reality of Charles's manipulative and self-serving actions. reflecting on the drastic steps I needed to take next in our crumbling marriage. Charles's smirk was utterly repulsive as he presented me with an ultimatum in a tone that dripped with false generosity. "You have two choices. Move in with my parents or file for divorce," he said. I took a deep breath, looked him squarely in the eyes, and with a calm resolve replied, "I choose divorce, and I won't regret it." Charles laughed dismissively, thinking I'd eventually lament my decision. "From now on, we'll communicate through this lawyer," he said as he handed me a business card. He then added, with a subtle demand, "And don't forget to transfer the inheritance to my account." Silently, I began packing my belongings. As I walked out the door, Charles's voice followed me, a constant reminder, "Don't forget about the inheritance." Once I had recounted everything to my mother, she was shocked, not realizing the full extent of the strain between Charles and me. She apologized for sharing details about the inheritance under his pressure. "It's all right, Mom. I should have been more open, but him threatening you is unforgivable," I reassured her. I then asked if I could stay at our family home until I found a new place. She agreed without hesitation. The next day, my phone was inundated with calls from Charles, all of which I ignored. Eventually, he showed up at my parents' house, ringing the doorbell incessantly and causing a scene. My mother, worried about the disturbance, suggested I speak with him. "It might not resolve anything, but if he escalates further, we'll call the police," she said. Understanding her concern, I reluctantly agreed. With the security chain fastened, I opened the door just a crack. "This is getting out of hand, Patricia. When are you transferring that $6 million? I can't finish the renovations without it," Charles shouted, trying to shake the door. Remaining composed, I responded, "It's under consideration." Confused, Charles asked, "What do you mean, under consideration?" I took a deep breath and clarified, "What I inherited was my father's vacation house. It's a property, not cash, so I can't just transfer it to you." Charles's face registered shock. Sensing an opportunity, I pressed further. "And how did you manage to secure a $6 million renovation contract without any proof of funds?" "Well, I have a relative who owns a construction company," he admitted, somewhat deflated. I mentioned I'd be receiving a $6 million soon, so they skipped the usual checks. "If that's the case, remember," I began, leaving the sentence hanging as I closed the door firmly, cutting off any further discussion. Inside, I felt a mix of relief and resolve. It was clear that distancing myself from Charles was the right decision, and I was ready to begin the next chapter of my life, free from his manipulative grasp. I reminded Charles sternly as he fumbled in panic. "I warned you before we even talked about divorce," I told him. "I made it clear that this could happen." "You've got to be kidding me," he exclaimed, frustration evident in his voice. "I already paid a deposit of $5,000 for the renovations, planning to cover the rest in installments. Now, what am I supposed to do?" He continued to argue, grasping at straws. "The wife's property is the husband's too, right? Even if it's not in cash, hand over that $6 million vacation home. We're still married, right?" "You've got it all wrong, Charles," I replied, my tone resolute. "Inherited property isn't shared, it's solely mine. Not a cent belongs to you. And just so we're clear, we're not a couple anymore. We're total strangers." Upon hearing this, Charles's desperation turned to anger. His face flushed a deep red as he raised his voice even louder. "Stop playing games. I'm calling off the divorce. Give me the inheritance right now," he demanded, trying to reach through the gap in the door. As the situation escalated, my mother, witnessing the altercation, quickly dialed the police. Charles withdrew his hand when he heard her on the phone, but then, with a sinister smirk, he declared, "I'm done with you," and fled the scene. After he left, the police arrived. The footage from the doorbell camera suggested that they might take action. The officers emphasized the importance of my safety and advised me to avoid any engagement with Charles in the future. They instructed me to keep the doors locked and, if necessary, pretend I wasn't home. 5 days later, I received a call from the police regarding the documentation concerning my father's real estate. I had put the real estate documents in my bag after moving back to my parents' house post-divorce, only to find them missing later. Learning that the documents had been recovered, I headed to the police station where, to my shock, Charles was present. It turned out Charles was the thief who had stolen the documents. I demanded an explanation. Wearing a sullen expression, he muttered, "You thought there might be cash in your bag since you inherited $6 million, right? So when I went through your stuff, I stumbled upon some important-looking documents related to the inheritance and decided to take them." Charles explained that he hadn't examined the documents closely at the time. It was only after learning from me that the $6 million wasn't in cash that the reality of his situation sunk in. His actions, driven by desperation and misguided assumptions, had led us to this pivotal and revealing moment. When Charles realized that what he had taken was the property title for a vacation house rather than cash, he decided to try converting the inheritance into money. He took the title to a real estate agent, hoping to initiate a sale, and was even accompanied by my in-laws. However, upon my arrival at the realtor's office, it became clear that the sale couldn't proceed. The title was still in my father's name, and the inheritance division had just been finalized. I was in the process of finding a notary to transfer the title to my name. Even if the inheritance had been settled, the property was still legally mine, which would make it nearly impossible for Charles to sell it without my consent. Frustrated, I confronted them, and they ludicrously suggested that I should buy the property myself since it belonged to my father-in-law. This absurd claim led the real estate agent's employees to call the police, likely due to Charles's aggressive behavior, which raised suspicions. As I stood in shock, Charles began to make desperate claims to the police officer. "I was just trying to sell it on her behalf. I didn't steal anything. I haven't done anything wrong. Please let me go," he pleaded, contradicting his earlier admission about taking the documents. Remaining composed, I clarified to the officer, "That's not true. I didn't ask him to sell anything. He stole it on his own. Plus, the documents he took were just copies, not the originals. Even if he tried, he couldn't have sold them." "You set me up! Don't play games with me!" Charles shouted, his voice filled with fury. I responded coolly, "What are you even talking about? You stole on your initiative, and now all you do is spout nonsense. Just face the consequences of your criminal actions." Frustrated and cornered, Charles bit his lip in anger. As a result of his actions and the evidence against him, he was arrested for theft. With the news of Charles's arrest and his loss of the $5,000 deposit, my in-laws were disgraced as the parents of a criminal. They felt compelled to move from their town due to the embarrassment. Later, they harbored resentment towards the real estate agency that had reported Charles, resorting to making harassing calls and spreading false rumors. The real estate agency, understandably outraged, filed a lawsuit against them for obstructing business and attempted fraud, as they had tried to illegally sell a property they did not own. This series of events highlighted the lengths to which Charles and his parents were willing to go and the eventual consequences of their deceitful actions. Following the lawsuit, my in-laws found themselves financially drained, having had to pay a substantial amount in damages. In a state of desperation, they reached out to me for help. "Patricia, please, we used up our savings for the deposit and now we're in debt because of the settlement." My ex-mother-in-law's voice trembled with urgency over the phone. However, I felt no sympathy for them given the circumstances. "Why are you asking me for help? I'm divorced from Charles, and as far as I'm concerned, you are strangers to me now," I responded firmly. She pleaded, "You're wealthy, aren't you? Can you spare some money? We'll pay you back, I promise." "I don't believe that for a second. I'm ending this call. Don't contact me again," I replied coldly before hanging up and blocking their numbers. I had already blocked Charles's number long ago. Concerned for our safety, especially since Charles knew where my parents lived, I decided to sell our family home. My mother and I then moved to ensure our safety and peace of mind. As for the vacation house that sparked so much conflict, I put it back on the market. It sold quickly and without any complications, allowing my mother and me to start anew. Now we live in a peaceful environment, away from the past turmoil, cherishing the memories of my father and enjoying our newfound tranquility.